This is the Extra Point Podcast from Arizona's family.
All right, welcome to the Extra Point Podcast. The Arizona Wildcats, we thought for the last couple of years here, like the anvil was going to fall on the program, and when news broke that the feds were involved and there was payments to DeAndre Ayton from Sean Miller that it was going to turn into a Pac-12 outpost. That does not appear to be the case, so let's get an expert's opinion here in the Extra Point Podcast. Shane Dale, a longtime Valley sports voice, now a podcaster, a writer about the University of Arizona, all things Wildcats. And just first of all, man, it's been a while since we've spoke. How are you?
Doing well. A couple of jobs removed from my sports media role of working in corporate America, but my side hustle is as you mentioned, the Wildcat Country podcast, which you can catch on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube.
All right. Did you think when all of this came down back before COVID, I remember we ran down to Tucson. They were playing the Stanford Cardinals. Sean Miller, people thought he was vindicated because he came back to coach, and then there was the Mark Schlabach report of him on tape paying Ayton, or I guess saying he would pay Ayton. Did you think when that happened that we would be here today where the Wildcats appear to have gotten slapped on the wrist? No?
Well, at the time, I didn't think so. I thought that things looked dire for Arizona. We're thinking, multiple years of NCAA tournament bans. Sean Miller's probably gone, but he insisted he was innocent. That the allegation, specifically the Mark Schlabach report, was false, which I think, by all accounts, seems to be the case. They had the benefit, Arizona did, of going through this independent counsel, which will be disbanded once they're done with the rest of their cases. That's independent from the NCAA, because previously the NCAA really acted as judge and jury in these cases, and they decided, for at least for a few cases, not to do that. And Arizona benefited from that as well. So it was a long, strange road. And then you think Sean Miller, after a few years, okay, he's still at Arizona. I guess he's going to survive this. And then they let him go a couple of years ago. I didn't think we'd be here 5 years later finally talking about the decision and all this. I thought that might have happened at least a couple of years earlier. I mean, 2 jobs ago, I worked in sports media, and that was over 3 years ago. So I thought that things would be resolved a lot sooner, but certainly at the time that the allegations came out, not only against Book Richardson, but then the ESPN report, it seemed like Arizona men's basketball was going to be in trouble for a long time. And even though Sean Miller was dismissed eventually, that obviously hasn't been the case.
Well, and the great coincidence here is probably what they did, they can now do legally. I would think. I mean, that's got to play into it, some in this, I would think. What do you say on that?
Not necessarily. I think that a lot of people might think that Arizona got away with it or got away with cheating. And look, I'm an Arizona alum. I'm an Arizona fan. So like when I do the podcast, I'm kind of putting on my fan hat as opposed to my journalist hat. It's been a little while, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But several reasons why I wasn't terribly surprised at the ruling today after what we've learned. Number one, what Book Richardson did was very illegal, at least at the time. It didn't necessarily benefit Arizona on the court. And I think that might be important. Nothing that he did was like, he didn't, for example, pay Raleigh Elkins to play at Arizona specifically. Okay. So that's number one. I think that's important to keep in mind. Number two, the IARP noted that Sean Miller apparently kept very concise records when he was at Arizona, as far as what they did in terms of compliance and making sure that they stayed in that lane. And so I think that may be why he wasn't really held accountable like some other coaches might have been, even though the head coach can be held accountable for their assistants' actions, why he didn't receive any sort of suspension himself, even though he's at Xavier now, he still could have received that suspension. So that's number two. And number three, you look at IARP's, their precedent over the last several cases. They don't specifically like to hand out postseason bans to teams. And one of the reasons why one of the members mentioned is because they don't want to punish the current student athletes for what's happened in the past that he had nothing to do with. And so that plus Arizona self-imposed a postseason ban 2 years ago. So that's important to note. So a lot of the penalties that Arizona was listed in the IARP's report, we're all going to be in AARP by the time it was done, right? But in the IARP's report were things that Arizona already did. So I think they appreciated the university, took responsibility there. You keep in mind the other things I mentioned. And so at the time, like your first question, at the time, it looked like, all the news was coming out in 2017. It looked like that program was going to be down in the dumps for years, if not a decade or more. But over the last few months or the last couple of years, really, it looked like Arizona might not get the kind of punishment that the so-called death penalty that we thought. And that was obviously the case when we saw the ruling today.
You think they're breathing a sigh of relief down in the old Pueblo getting this news today? Or do you think they kind of knew this one was coming?
Yeah, and I think that Tommy Lloyd, and he's talked about it, yeah, he's prepared for this. He knew that some sort of sanctions were going to come, and they did get some, obviously. The scholarship reduction, even though I think that's already taken place, they have a 7-week communication ban that's going to come up, so they're going to have to work around that. So there are some things in place. They got a $5,000 fine. I know it all seems like kind of a slap on the wrist, and ultimately it really is. I mean, we're being honest about it. But yeah, I think that Tommy Lloyd's done a good job of preparing for this. And now that the smoke is finally cleared, even though they are going to experience some penalties, they have to forfeit some wins, whatever. No one really cares about that. I think it's a breath of fresh air for the program and for Tommy Lloyd and for Sean Miller, I'm sure as well, who I'm sure definitely feels vindicated today.
Well, I mean, we have that great shot of the fan holding up the vindicated with the Arizona A when we went down there 3 years ago before COVID. That was a wild night because I was in the newsroom and I got the word, hey, you're going to Tucson. I said I don't have credentials for the game. You're going to Tucson, so we ended up getting in, and it was just a weird scene. But an assistant coach went to jail. That's the strangest part about this. The assistant coach went to jail. In your mind, I mean, Sean Miller, he was responsible for everything in the program. Where does the relationship stand right now with Sean Miller and Book Richardson in your mind?
I can't speak to their relationship. I don't really know what's going on there. If I had to put myself in Book Richardson's shoes, I'd probably feel like he definitely got the brunt of the penalty, and Sean Miller got off pretty good shape, really. The only thing I guess I was surprised about was that Sean Miller didn't receive any suspensions. I thought he might be suspended for at least a couple of games, like Bill Self was at Kansas. I think he was suspended for 4 games, and one of his assistants was as well. So that surprised me a little bit. What Book Richardson did was wrong, even though some of that stuff's legal now, still wrong in the past. And I think that he's accepted that. But even with everything I mentioned, I was still surprised that Sean Miller essentially did receive no penalty because he's free to go on at Xavier, not have to deal with any of this stuff. And a lot of coaches have experienced, like I think back to Pete Carroll and him escaping USC when they got a lot of penalties, and it's not quite the same thing. But I'm not saying like Sean Miller, like quote unquote, got away with it. But I did think he was going to at least be suspended for a couple of games, and that turned out not to happen.
Yeah, and it seems in just my mind, it just seems like this is the ultimate situation. Like, your job is to take the fall if something happens here, and Book Richardson was the guy that took the fall. And maybe he speaks more on this subject, but it does seem like Arizona, from a strategic standpoint, was able to really drag this thing out long enough that as we got word today, you're like, oh my gosh, I'd forgotten all about that. I mean, how much was this a something hanging over in Tucson in the future of the basketball program?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, and my co-host Eric Cohen and I, we recorded an episode last night, of course, because the next day this news comes out. That's what always happens. Yeah. But it's funny because we talked about, okay, we should record an emergency podcast tonight after the ruling comes out. And then we saw the ruling and we're like, we can wait until next week to talk about this. There's really not much there. And I think that was over time, that was kind of the consensus that number one, a lot of fans kind of forgot about it because number one, it was taking so long, but also because we saw some of the other rulings that the IARP made. And we're thinking, okay, it's probably not going to be that bad. They self-imposed the postseason ban, that's done. And that's really, I mean, if we're being honest, that's really what all fans care about is the postseason ban. We want to know, is Arizona going to be able to compete for a national championship this season? And they will be. So in that regard, I think that it's a sigh of relief, but I think that it had gotten to the point where most fans would have been shocked if they had received an additional postseason ban, considering the rulings that some other schools got before the Arizona ruling was announced.
All right. And on the court this year, you think the Wildcats are a contender? What makes you think that?
Well, and it gives me another opportunity to plug my own podcast. We actually had Casey Jacobson on, who's a Fox News Pac-12 network analyst, used to be a star at Stanford, play for the Suns, and he has a criteria for what makes a Final Four team. And the four pieces are great guard play, experience, a top 20 defense in Ken Pomeroy's metrics, and future first-round NBA draft picks. Now, Arizona was good in 3 of those 4 categories last year. The only one they really weren't good in was experience. They have that this year. Their glaring weakness at this point would be the defense. They are number 1 in Ken Palm in adjusted offense. They're around 70 in defense. They have a long way to go there. So, look, they're better than expected. I think almost all of us expected them to have a little more of a rebuild process after losing 3 NBA draft picks and 2 first-rounders this past season. And credit to Tommy Lloyd for refilling the roster very effectively, and not only that, but getting some of these guys like Umar Ballo, who was a role player last year, looks like a Pac-12 Player of the Year candidate earlier this year. He's done a great job, and his staff have done a great job developing those guys. They got a great game, top 10 matchup against Tennessee coming up on Saturday. That's going to be a great test because it's going to be the number 1 offense in Ken Palm versus the number 1 defense in Ken Palm in Tennessee. Plus, Tennessee beat them last year, so there's that revenge factor if you want to consider that. But grand scheme of things, they're definitely better than expected. They have more experience this year. They have to improve defensively. They have to be able to battle those teams that like to slow it down and, run that slow plodding pace like Houston did when they beat Arizona last season. I still think that they have a little ways to go in terms of getting there because I think those are the kinds of teams that win in March. But for now, certainly they look like a Pac-12 contender again. I think they're worthy of their top 10 ranking, even though they had that loss at Utah. They've beaten some other top 25 teams. And I think that if they improve a bit defensively and get better on that side of the ball, I think they could be poised for a deep tournament run. But that's a big if. They have a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean the Houston thing last year, I think no one really saw that one coming. But you see where Houston's ranked and how they're playing. That kind of tells you all you need to know. Might have a rematch of Houston and Arizona in the national championship. As far as Wildcat Country goes, when can we find your stuff and what's your next angle here?
Well, we talk football throughout football season. We'd like to have great guests on, guests who provide great analysis, like Casey Jacobson. We had AJ Bramlett on, and he was a '97 national champion with Arizona a couple weeks ago. Next week, we're going to try to get Aaron Torres, who's been a Sean Miller apologist for a long time, and he himself feels very vindicated today. Wildcat Country. You can find us on YouTube, find us on Apple, find us on Spotify. My co-host Eric Cohen and I have been doing this for over a couple of years now. We've developed a pretty good following. So like I said, we try to have great analysts on the show. We try to learn something ourselves as opposed to just throwing out our opinion out there, which we love to do. So find us on Wildcat Country, and our last episode is up. We posted that last night before the IARP decision, of course, but still some great analysis there from Casey Jacobson if you're a Wildcat fan. And if you're a Sun Devil fan, we talked a little bit about ASU's early success too, so there's something in there for you as well. But you can find us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube.
Are you writing any more books?
I certainly hope not. I think I'm done for now. You never know. If I get inspired again down the road, maybe. But I think I'm done writing about the Territorial Cup for now. I'm just glad that my Wildcats, you see my mini cup behind me, finally got past the Sun Devils for the first time in 6 years.
Yeah, I saw you. Weren't you down there fighting somebody in the field? I think I saw that. You and Cohen. The Wildcats were fighting everybody, right?
Oh yeah, we were out of control. Yeah, I mean, we had a couple. We spent a couple days in jail. My employer was very understanding about it. Fortunately, I'm back at work now. But yeah, a couple years probation. I'll be allowed out of the state again.
All right. Are you getting back in the sports media world ever again? Or are you good? Are you good? You still are, but full time.
I think I'm good where I'm at. I get my fix really with the podcast. I enjoy doing that, and it's kind of on our own time, which is nice. I'm in corporate America now. I got a great job in the communications department, working for an agricultural company, which I love. So I think I'm good for now, but you never know. And like I said, as long as I get my connection to sports through this podcast, I think I'm all set for the time being.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for making time for us tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
The Extra Point Podcast is a production of 3TV, CBS5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.